Alright, so the next thing we're going to have a look at is different ways we can define matter. So we've had a look at what matter is in terms of being made up of atoms, but there's different ways that we can define the ways that these atoms come together to form larger components. So when we have a compound, this is basically when you've got atoms together connecting that are from more than two different elements. So for example, in our example we've seen so far with water, water is made up of one oxygen atom and two hydrogen atoms. So this satisfies the definition of a compound because it's got two different types of elements atoms, hydrogen and oxygen. And let's have a look at the elements. They're also considered matter as well as the compounds. And remember I showed you the elements on the periodic table. So each of the different elements on the periodic table has different atom types, and that makes them different from all other atoms. So there's going to be different elements atoms in the compounds here. So you can see that we've got both oxygen and hydrogen atoms making up these compounds. Alright, so let's now look at how atoms can actually contribute to making larger compounds and molecules. So it's important that atoms are actually able to connect together to make larger components. If we just had individual atoms flying around with no attachments, then larger groups of atoms wouldn't really exist, at least not in a meaningful way. So we are only made possible by atoms coming together and attaching to make larger components. For example, our DNA and RNA in our cells, all the proteins that we rely on to do jobs in our body, wouldn't exist if atoms didn't attach together. So atoms are the basis for all larger structures. So let's have a look at how they can contribute to creating larger groups of atoms. So atoms join together to form groups. So we'll investigate exactly why this is in a later session, but essentially atoms like to form these groups to become more stable. So a group of atoms is called a molecule. Okay, so if you have any group of atoms, whether they be the same type of atom or two different types of atoms, then we can call that a molecule. So for example, H2O, water, is a molecule. It's got more than one atom attached together. So here we can see one of the examples. We've got water, and that's made up of one oxygen atom and two hydrogens here. So that's one example of a molecule. Another example of a molecule is our oxygen molecule. You've probably seen O2 as a representation for oxygen, and that means we've got two separate oxygen atoms coming together. So you can see here that molecules can be made up of either the same type of atom, two oxygens, or two different types of atoms. In theory, the molecules can actually have many different types of atoms involved. There's no limit to the number of different types of atoms involved here. So as long as they can come together to form the group in a way that makes all the atoms stable, then it's possible for that particular group of atoms to form a molecule. So how can we define a molecule based on what I've shown you in this slide? What does a molecule mean to you? So the simplest thing is basically just to think of a molecule as a group of atoms, atoms connected together. So what type of atoms can be in a molecule? Well, the atoms in a molecule can either be the same type of atom, or they can be a combination of different types of atoms. As long as you have more than one type of atom, as long as you have more than one atom together, that's what designates a molecule rather than an individual atom. So when the atom is by itself, we just call it an atom. But as soon as it's part of a group where there's two or more atoms, even if those atoms are the same type of element, we can then call it a molecule. So therefore we can say O2 is an oxygen molecule made up of two oxygen atoms. We can also say the water molecule H2O, is made up of 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen atom. But it's the fact that they come together as a group that makes them a molecule. So there is a distinction though, because we have another definition. As well as being a molecule, some components are what we call a compound. And this is a molecule that has more than one type of atom. So this is where you have to have more than one type of atom present. So for example, with the O2 molecule, there's only one type of atom present. So that would not be considered a compound, because compounds have to have more than one atom type present. What about water then? Would water be a compound? Well, it's got more than one atom type present, so yes, that would be considered a compound. So what is the difference between water and the water and oxygen molecules that makes the water a compound but oxygen not? It's essentially the fact that water has more than one different type of atom, because we've got elements atoms from hydrogen and elements atoms from oxygen. Therefore, we've got more than one different type of atom. In oxygen, there's only one elements atom present. Therefore, it is not a compound. So we can say that, not compound, because there's only one atom type present. So you can see how some components, like water, are going to be both molecules and compounds because they satisfy the definition for both. They're a molecule because they have more than one type of atom, and they're a compound because they have more than one type. So I'll start that again. So you can see that some groups of atoms can actually be considered molecules and compounds at the same time. So it's a molecule, for example, H2O is a molecule because it contains more than one atom. But it's also a compound because there's different types of atoms within that group. So here we can see another example of a compound. This one is carbon dioxide, CO2. So you can see that this time it's got one carbon atom and 2 oxygen atoms. And that means that we've got 2 different types of atoms. One of the element carbon, and then we've got 2 of the element oxygen. Therefore, it's satisfying the definition of a compound where we've got more than one atom type present. So keep these definitions in mind because we'll see these definitions lots throughout the course. So difference between a molecule, compound, and an atom are all very key. So make sure we've got that down pat before moving on to the next part of the session. It's a little bit tricky, the distinction there. So if you're a little bit unclear, I encourage you to look at a few other resources or maybe just re-watch this part of the lecture just to make sure you're 100% clear, because we will see these definitions lots throughout the sessions that we're going to be going through. So here we can see that second example of water being a compound because it has both hydrogen and oxygen atoms. Alright, so let's have a look at another flowchart to combine what we've looked at so far. So as I've told you earlier, matter is made up of atoms. And those atoms contain subatomic particles. So these are the smaller components that make up individual atoms. And there's 3 types of these subatomic particles in atoms. One is a proton that has a positive charge, and it is located in the central part of the atom, which is a ball-like structure called the nucleus. So represent a proton, in this case, with a P with a plus on it because it's got that positive charge. In comparison, we've got an electron that is negatively charged, hence the negative on the little ball here. So it's the negative subatomic particle that will actually exist around the outside of the nucleus. So you might remember that picture I showed you earlier where we had the components moving around the nucleus, which was the central ball. So those are the electrons, which is the second type of the subatomic particle. And the third is the neutron. So the neutron is shown as an N with a 0 on it because it has no charge. Okay? So the neutron is present in the nucleus along with the protons. So we've got the nucleus ball essentially sitting in the center here, which is made up of the protons and the neutrons, and then around the outside we've got electrons that are moving around in a circular fashion. Okay, so all three of our subatomic particles contribute to the structure of the atom, but within the atom we've got these two defined regions. The nucleus, which is in the center, made up of the protons and the neutrons, and then the electrons moving around the outside in constant motion. So I told you earlier that all matter is made up of subatomic particles. And now we also know that all atoms are made up of these smaller components called subatomic particles. And we can learn a lot about the behavior and the differences between atoms based on the subatomic particles that these contain. So a lot of what we'll be doing today is investigating what these subatomic particles are and what they can actually tell us about a particular type of atom. So an interesting question now. What makes an oxygen atom different from a carbon atom? So I don't really expect you guys to be able to answer this yet because we haven't really talked about it, but it is an interesting question to consider. Why is one atom type, oxygen, different from another atom type, carbon? What makes them different? And basically it comes down to the number of subatomic particles they have. The oxygen atom actually has 16 subatomic particles in comparison to carbon that only has 12. And it brings us to an interesting point to remember, and that's here in red, the fact that each different atom that's present on the periodic table has a different number of subatomic particles. And it is this that actually allowed us to say, okay, this is a hydrogen atom and this is a carbon atom. The difference between all of the atom types, the elements, is actually how many subatomic particles they have. Okay, so this is what the scientists used originally to designate what each element actually is. It was finding new atoms with different numbers of subatomic particles. Because based on these subatomic particles, this is actually going to dictate how the atom behaves, which we'll learn a little bit more about in later sessions. But essentially, what I want you to take away from this slide is that every element's atom is different because of its unique number of subatomic particles. So a little bit more about these subatomic particles now. So you can see a few representations of this here. So in the center here of this representation of a carbon atom, we've got 6 protons and 6 neutrons congregating together. So what structure is formed by the 6 protons and 6 neutrons? We call that the nucleus. So the nucleus, you can think of it as a central ball in the center of an atom that allows the protons and neutrons to essentially stick together. And what about these green ones around the outside of the nucleus? What are those? Well, these are the electrons, which are held around the outside of the nucleus by the attraction between the nucleus and the electrons. So why do you think the electrons might be attracted to the nucleus? Well, it's the presence of these positively charged subatomic particles, which are the protons, because positives attract to negatives, just like magnets. If you have 2 magnets where you've got the negative part of the magnet next to another magnet that has the positive part there, they'll be attracted together, okay? Because different charges are going to attract together. So when you've got a positive and negative, they'll try and draw closer together. And that's exactly what's holding the atom together. So we've got the positive protons in the nucleus, which is holding these electrons rather close by around the outside of the atom. So here we can see that representation of the atom that I showed you earlier, where we've got the central ball made up of even smaller balls, which are the protons and the electrons, that's the nucleus, and then we've got these electrons moving around the outside very quickly in constant motion. So each ring that you can see here in the structure is basically the path of the electron. So you can imagine the electrons just continuing to loop around these rings around the outside of the nucleus.